In 1970, our guest was involved in a motorcycle accident which sent him to the hospital for 33 days. And while he was there, he had an experience that changed the course of his life. The experience caused him to ask the big questions and to try to seek the big answers. And he put his findings in this book, The Death Experience. His name is Alan Ross Hugenot. I'm very happy to welcome Alan. Alan, I'm so glad to have you here.
I'm grateful to be here, both to be alive and to be here in Mountain View tonight.
Thank you. Tell us what your experience was like after the motorcycle accident, which changed the course of your life.
Well, I was taken to the hospital in an ambulance, and I had a head injury. I was quite injured. I've got scars all over. Motorcycle wrecks are a pretty rough thing. And I went unconscious about 4 hours later. They don't cut your head open like they do now when you have we've learned in Iraq to cut the skull open and let the brain swell. Mm-hmm. They didn't do that 43 years ago. And so as my brain swelled, I went unconscious. And I was out for maybe 8 hours, and I came back the following day. While I was out, I went directly to the light. If you've studied near-death experiences at all, everyone talks about the light. It's a being of light. I spent some time with the being of light, and it was the best place I've ever been. Can't wait to go back. The message I got was, yet a little while and you can return, and it's only been 43 years in this little while. But it was like being home. It was like I'd known this being of light for several thousand years. It was where I came from. And I didn't want to come back here. But it was like duty calls. You're not ready to come yet. You have to go back. So I came back. And of course I came back into the body, and as I slammed into the body and the feeling of this denseness, it was really awful to come back. And it wasn't the pain of my injuries. It was the pain of this existence that was difficult. And I described that in the book.
Mm-hmm. It's evocative that you would say you felt you knew the being of light for thousands of years. Somehow that does something to me, but could you say a little bit more about what it did to you? How familiar this was? It seemed to be home. And was the being of light really a being, or was it something more than that? It
was definitely a being, although it didn't have arms, legs, face, all that sort of thing. It was mostly a light, and that's why it's very hard to describe. When we're here, we use words that describe things, and this is more than a thing. This is a consciousness. This is a being that doesn't take physical form. And you're very much a part of it. I felt so at home, more real than this. This is an illusion. That's more real. I just have to say it that way. I don't know how else to describe that. And I felt like that's where I'd always been, and always been trying to get back to all this time. Still trying to get back there.
Mm-hmm. If you can say that this life is an illusion, does that mean that your state of consciousness was enhanced?
My state of consciousness was definitely enhanced. And when I came back into the body, I had to lose some of that consciousness and come back into a limited consciousness, which we exist in here. Mm-hmm. And most of that consciousness annihilates as you come in, and you might see sparklers or flames. I saw flames. P.H.M. Atwater sees sparklers. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people believe that's the consciousness annihilating, right, because it has to get smaller to fit into the physics of this reality, mm-hmm, in this body, which is very dense. And I remember very clearly slamming back into it, and the colors of red coming down over the white light, like a liquid, like tendrils of tie-dyed batik or something, just coming down and then just coming down like that and closing it off. Mm-hmm. And I see that as the veil of tears shutting down, right, or the veil of Isis.
Mm-hmm. Were you clinically dead?
I wasn't clinically dead. I still had a heart rate and had a brainwave, but I was unconscious and out of body. Mm-hmm. but I wasn't clinically dead.
Yeah.
Many near-death experiences are actually clinically dead, but I was not.
So my question is, if many of these near-death experiences are clinically dead, and if their brain is non-functional, then how can they experience an enhanced state of consciousness?
The consciousness is not a byproduct of the brain, as we try to imagine that it is in our current materialist viewpoint or paradigm.
Now that's going to be shocking for many people.
It's shocking to most physicists who haven't had a near-death experience. For those who have, it's not so shocking. They've been there and seen that. Your consciousness goes on even when your brain is ceased. And this is the afterlife, really. That's what it is. Your brain is ceased altogether, and yet consciousness is still alive. The consciousness must continue to exist. If you look at the conservation of energy, it's one of our laws that we use. And conservation of energy says if the consciousness is actually an energy, if it's something material in this material existence, and I may believe that it's not, but if it is material, the consciousness uses up energy. What happens to that energy when you die? It just doesn't just disappear. Conservation of energy says it has to go somewhere. And there's no reason that consciousness should violate this law, and all the other things in the physical world cannot violate this law. Conservation of energy says it has to go somewhere. So it's pretty obvious right there that consciousness continues to exist after death.
In life, why is consciousness focused in the body?
In life, why is consciousness focused on the body? Now, this is a belief, okay? I can't prove this with a scientific theory, but I believe we come here to exist in the body. We want to be in the body. When I was told I had to go back, it was because I wasn't finished with whatever I came here to do, and so I had to return to the body. Well, if that has truth, as it feels to me that it does, then we come into this existence to have experiences. And so we leave our consciousness, our larger consciousness over there, and we hunker down and get into the body to have this experience. A lot of near-death experiences say, this is a great Disneyland ride. We love it. We come here and people keep reincarnating because they want to be here.
We enjoy the pain?
We enjoy the pain, I guess. To me, this is painful. That's what's here, is the pain. Yeah. And when you're out of body, there's no pain. There's no anguish. There's no worry. And those are the things that were very wonderful when I was in the light. No pain, no worry, no problems. Just wonderful relaxation.
Right. Alan, this brings us to kind of a crucial point. We've been told that the body is the result of evolution, and that consciousness is the result of the brain. Now, you seem to be saying something different. The body may be a result of evolution, but maybe consciousness is not also a product of evolution if it's not a product of the brain. So where does consciousness come from?
Well, as a physicist, I look at quantum physics, which is probably the best, most proven theory that we have. And in quantum physics, consciousness must exist in order to have the observation. If you have everything exists as a wave function, kind of potentiality where it could be, and suddenly when it's observed, the particle forms and you have the collapse of the wave function, okay, or the collapse of the Schrodinger equation. And when that happens, it requires an observer. Now, if you take quantum physics and realize that it applies to all of physics in the universe, and you go back to the Big Bang, there had to be someone at the Big Bang to observe the wave function to have the function collapse.
Wow.
And consciousness had to be where they're making the observation.
Wow. What was that consciousness?
Now, it must be bigger than this one and that one. And so if you think about our consciousness as grains of sand on a beach, each of us is a grain of sand, and the magnitude of a beach full of these grains of sand of consciousness, if it was all together in one place, it would be a pretty powerful consciousness.
Right.
Now, the religious people would like me to say that's God. I'd prefer to say something like the Force. May the Force be with you, like Yoda says. Right. I would rather describe it that way, a very powerful place with all that consciousness. But consciousness had to observe the Big Bang, or it wouldn't have happened, according to quantum physics.
So you're saying that the big consciousness observed it?
I can't really put that together for you. I can say consciousness was there to make the observation, and I would assume it was a big consciousness, bigger than mine.
Yeah. You were recently at the IANS conference, and you spoke there. What was there about that conference that really stood out in your mind that you'd like to share with us?
Well, at the conference, which was over Labor Day in Alexandria, Virginia, I was there talking about the physics of the afterlife. And also I described in another session what it's like to die, which is the last 5 chapters of my book describe what it's like to die for those that are facing death. But what I liked about the conference was the attitude of the people there. Most of them, there's a whole lot of people there that have had near-death experiences. They're not driven by ego like we are in most of life. They're driven by loving each other, getting along with people, spreading what they know, sharing. It's just a whole different attitude. And I was there with Dr. Alexander and Dr. Mary Neal, both of whom have had near-death experiences and are published authors. And all of these people have a different feeling, a different attitude about life. They see life differently because they have a knowledge that life doesn't end when you die. Mm-hmm. So there's no fear of death. I have no fear of death. I can't wait to get back there, honestly. Mm-hmm. Now you say, well, then if you can't wait to get back there, why don't you commit suicide? Well, we know that we can't go there until we're finished here. So committing suicide, we have to come back anyway. Mm-hmm. And we want to go there permanently. So we're all happy to be here until it's done.
Yeah. How do you know it's done? How do you know you've finished? How do you know what your mission is? I've heard that, you have a feeling that you have a mission, but it may not be articulated, so that when you come back here, you're fumbling around trying to find out what the mission is. Is that part of, is finding out what your mission is part of the mission?
That's part of the mission, and when we're born without a near-death experience, we're just born into our existence here, and let's call it a normal life, that's our purpose, is to find out why we're here. We're reminded of it big time when we have a near-death experience, that you can't leave until you finish your purpose, so you better find out what it is. Plus, we know we want to go back to the other side, and so we are very anxious to find out our purpose. And so it sort of comes to you over time. The near-death experience, the IANS has found that there's major changes in the psychology of people who have had near-death experiences. They become less greedy, they're less egotistical, they don't really care about material things at all. They're not so crazy as to give all their money away, but they don't really care so much. They're not so concerned about if they have a better car than the other guy, that sort of thing.
What is it about the near-death experience that makes this change in people? I know you've told me that you've experienced the same thing. Before you wanted to be a winner, now you're not so much concerned with that. What does concern you, and why would this experience of the light, of an enhanced consciousness, cause people to be less egotistical or less ego-centered?
We realize that we're on a progression, that we're on a learning process, we're on a progression. We have things we came here to do. We tend to be more loving. We realize we have eternity. We have forever to get this done. That we're not going to come out of this until we finish it, and that may take 2 or 3 lifetimes. We know that the purpose of being here is to make that progression. So we're interested in growing spiritually, and it's mostly spiritual growth that we're talking about. The exact thing that St. Paul talks about it. He had a near-death experience on the road to Damascus. He talks about it in Corinthians. Most times when you hear about Paul's experience on the road to Damascus, you're reading Luke in Acts, in the book of Acts, and Luke is just a follower of Paul, but he actually writes about it in 2 Corinthians 12. And there he talks about the idea of being 2 people and becoming the better person. And that's what we're up to. And so we really shift. There's a real shift. P.J. Atwater calls it the brain shift. Your brain reconstitutes, and you see things differently.
What is the evidence that consciousness survives death?
Well, we have 6 areas of research that have been going on quite extensively in the last 40 years. One is near-death experiences, which is IANS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies, and I've been a member of that for 17 years. We publish a professional journal that publishes both sides, pro and con, and we argue it out. And then there's the University of Arizona, where they study after-death communications, Gary Swartz. And then there's Ian Stevenson's operations, and he died in 2007, but Bruce Grayson has taken over now. And that's at the University of Virginia, where they study children who remember past lives. They've been doing that for 50 years there. They have over 3,000 lives that they've verified the details of. And then we have PAIR. That's what this green, everybody wants it to turn green.
It just did.
Yes,
green.
This light here is PAIR's. It's a random generator that measures our feelings, and if we want it to turn green, and if enough of us want it to turn green, it will.
What do we feel to make it turn? It just turned white. What does that mean?
It's turned white because some are thinking red and some are thinking blue, and it's doing what it's doing. But it's doing that randomly based on our feelings in the room. And this is produced, it's just a toy, and it's a Christmas toy that they make. But for 30 years, 40 years, 30 years at the university, and then they become a separate institution now. But Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research has been researching the ghost in the machine. That is our mind affecting a machine. And that's what this is. We're affecting it. And they do a lot of experiments with people off the street where they come in and they have, the one I'll describe is they have a ball thing that throws balls up in the air, and randomly half would fall to one side and half would fall to the other. It's between two pieces of glass, and it's either going to fall this way or that way. And they say to people off the street, okay, make the balls fall to the right. And the person takes thought, and pretty soon 52% are falling to the right and 48% falling the other way. Say, well, make them fall to the left. The same thing happens. With odds, when they do the statistical analysis, 3 billion to 1, the mind of inexperienced, untrained people can turn the light green, okay? And that's that proves that the consciousness exists outside the body and that we have this influence. That's one area, and I forget what the sixth area is right now. I've gone through
Let me see.
5 of them. But all these independent areas of science are replicating the evidence and the data that the other areas are replicating.
Yeah, there's the near-death experience, there's remembering past lives, after-death communication, past life regression, remote viewing, and psychokinesis.
Okay, remote viewing at Stanford Research Institute, Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, 24 years, the intelligence organizations in the United States were paying them, CIA and the NSA were paying them to research the ability to see things at a distance. And they have some very remarkable things where they bring in a psychic person and they see things on the other side of the world. All documented. A lot of it's still classified, but since 1995 they've been getting parts of it out, and we've been writing books about it. That proves the existence of the consciousness outside the body, where somebody moves their mind over to Russia and looks inside the factory, that sort of thing. We have that, and then we have the experience that like Brian Weiss has had. He's a psychiatrist, where people remember their past lives just like the children do, but they remember it under hypnotic suggestion. They put them into a hypnotic trance, and then they can remember the past life that they don't remember when they're normal here. Children remember it till about the age of 7. They start articulating about 3 to 5 years old. They start talking about past lives, if they remember one. And in the United States, we say, shh, Mommy doesn't want to hear you say things like that.
Is that why it fades after age 7?
Well, it fades if they don't talk about it and if they don't recognize it. If they recognize it, some people can remember it their whole life. There's a woman that Ian Stevenson was interviewing in 1972 when she was 54, and she was still remembering the prior life and what she had done there. Then she had started talking as a child, and that's, her name is Isabel, can't remember it just now, but she's in Western Brazil, and she remembered this, and she could still remember at age 54 because she talked about it before she was, when she was young, and kept talking about it right on through her life. If they don't, they may forget about it altogether. Most of us cannot remember what we were doing when we were 5 years old. We just don't. But children do remember their past lives, especially, and this is the thing that's amazing to us, if it's traumatic.
If it's traumatic.
Their death was traumatic. They'll remember the traumatic death. I look at that sometimes and say, well, we near-death experiencers have to return to this life. Maybe those children got killed early and had to have a second life. And that's why we have so many of them that had a tragic experience.
Yeah, Alan, you've mentioned these 6 areas that is, proof of the afterlife. I'd like to focus on one that might cause some people to wince, and that's after-death communication. You're particularly interested in this. Talk to me a bit about this.
I'm particularly interested in after-death communication because I found it to be real. And I was raised in a fundamentalist Christian family, and I was told that after-death communication was of the devil, and you shouldn't be involved in that. So it took me a long time. First, I had to have the near-death experience, which proved to me that the afterlife is there. And I tell this story in the progression in my book, how I progressed through it. I was at a place that was actually haunted, and my wife had a dream, and I didn't know the place was haunted.
You're at a place that was haunted?
I was at a bed and breakfast that the owner didn't want it to be haunted, but it was haunted. And she had a dream, and I tell the whole story, and I don't want to go into too much detail of it, but I tell the whole story. And the way it was, she told me about the dream in the morning. When we went to breakfast and the guy told us about the house, she jumped up and said, no, it wasn't a suicide, the guy was killed. And so then we spent 2 days talking to the owner and everything else, and I got the whole story. She had actually picked up this experience from that ghost haunting that house. Well, these kind of things moved me along from the fundamentalist position that I was raised in. And finally, then I studied for 6 years with the Morris Pratt Institute that the Spiritualist Church operates, and I'm a qualified medium, and I've been practicing doing that. I don't charge money, and I don't do it for people yet. I'm not that experienced. It's like learning to play the piano. It's very difficult. But I do get messages from the other side. I get messages from the other side when I personally go to a medium, and they get messages for me. One that was particularly interesting to me, if you'd like to hear it, is
Sure.
I went to a medium and had a private session at the Spiritualist Church, Golden Gate Spiritualist Church in San Francisco. And she said, Alan, the medium said, Alan, I've got a woman here. She's sort of a mother figure. She seems to be an architect, and I think she's from back east, Minnesota. And I said, mother figure, well, see, my mother, my grandmother. I said, I don't have any dead relatives who are architects from Minnesota. And that didn't seem to bother the medium. She said, well, she's got brown hair and brown or hazel eyes. She's not exactly an architect. She draws houses. Oh, and she's not exactly related to you, but she's a mother figure. I said, oh, it's my mother-in-law who drew the house that I'm living in, I never met her. She's been dead since before I met her daughter. But that's got to be who it is because she's got brown hair, hazel eyes. She drew the house. She was a real estate developer, and she's from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Well, that's the kind of veridical evidence I get. Well, then the message comes through, and it's about the house that I'm still living in. And the
what was the message?
Now, the message was we're working with a permit with the city, and it's very complicated. But the medium had no idea, and I had no idea that she would come through. Well, who else could it be? How does a medium know this stuff?
Okay, I'd like to ask you. Now
those are evidential things that tell me it is.
Sure. Now, you've studied mediumship, so when you make contact with, how can I put it, the spirits, is that
You're making contact with a living spirit who's just like a near-death experience person is out of body on the other side, and they're talking to you.
How do you know that?
Joan of Arc, in a play written by George Bernard Shaw, and in the play, Robert says to Joan of Arc, well, that's just something you got in your head. And Joan says, well, that's exactly how God talks to you, in your head. And that's how they talk to you. And the hard part, it's just like playing the piano, is to get the right key. You know, if you're going to play classical piano, you really have to work at it. It takes a lot of practice to know, am I thinking this, or is it coming from spirit?
That's just what I was going to ask you about.
Yeah.
So how do you know the difference? How do you distinguish between your own mental inclinations, your own thoughts, and what is supposedly coming through from the other side? How can you tell?
One of the ways I do it, you spend a long time studying how to do this, and we talk about colors, and we talk about a lot of things, and we talk about different levels and how you can tell if it's coming from the spirit you think it's come from or not, and that's very detailed stuff. Okay, it's like I say, like classical piano. It's very detailed. You got to learn to read music first, right? But what I do, I write, and I've gotten messages that say, just write. And so I write, and it's just like I do if I'm writing a book or something else. I'm just writing. But the writing, I get inspiration, and I write. And then I come back and look at it later, and I can see that that's not me writing that. I didn't think that. That's somebody else writing that. It's not automatic writing. It's me thinking it and writing it out, okay? And it's particularly if I get a message from my mother-in-law, Helen. If she is saying something, my wife will hear what I wrote. I'll read it to her, and she'll say, well, that's definitely Helen right there, because she said that, and she thinks that. And so you use methods like that to verify. I'm still in the learning process. It takes years to get this, to do it right. What the problem we have with mediums or psychics is a lot of people, they say, I'm going to be a psychic. And 6 months later, they're out there telling people fortunes and everything else. Well, it isn't that easy. And so they have to fake it if they're doing it in 6 months. You know, they have to, you know, the person's paying them, and they have to produce. In the spiritualist church, none of the mediums are paid. They all do it for free.
What is the benefit of consulting a medium?
You can know that your loved one's still living, they're still alive, and that life does not end with death. None of us that have a near-death experience are afraid of death. They have no fear of it. If I died right now, I'm happy. I'm ready to go. I have no fear of death, and that's a major benefit of knowing that you're if your loved one is over there and they can talk to you through a medium, then you're going to live on after death. And the big thing we fear when we have this materialist viewpoint that when the brain dies, the thoughts are gone and you're dead, when you think that way, this is all I got. This is the only chance I got. I better get it all now. And so you start grabbing and reaching and trying to get it all.
Materialism and egocentricity.
And egocentricity takes over.
Right.
If you know you have eternity, you might even have more lifetimes. What's the rush? You don't have to elbow your way to the front of the line. You can say, oh, go ahead.
You can relax your way through life.
Relax.
And yet you are also fearless.
You're fearless.
Yeah.
And that's the advantage of looking at all of this stuff and all of these things that I've talked about, all these branches of inquiry, prove that the consciousness exists outside the body and the afterlife exists. And it doesn't come by one thing. If you just study near-death experiences, you still may not be sure. If you just study after-death communications, you still may not be sure. But when you take them all and look at all of them, it's almost inescapable that one, consciousness exists outside the body, and two, the afterlife, continuing consciousness outside the body, exists and is real.
Right. Alan, we've come to the end of the show. Can you think of one thing you'd like to talk to the audience listening to this about that would help them with any fears they may have about death?
Don't fear death. Study these things I've talked about, and don't make up your mind until you've done all the studying, all the research.
Right.
And especially, don't worry if what you find out doesn't agree with what your preacher told you. The preachers are great guys. I'm not against them at all, but they each have a different story, and they can't all be right.
Right, right. Alan, thank you so much. We've come to the end, and you've certainly added some clarity about your research and your findings, and I'm so glad that you were nearly killed in a motorcycle accident years ago to share this with us.
Well, you're welcome. I'm glad to do it, and I'm grateful to be here.
Okay, Alan, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah.